Welcome, everyone. I'm Thomas Sir, CEO of Kinexum. Today's webcast is on 505b2 NDAs in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. Drug developers around the globe are racing to develop vaccines and medicines to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Developing new medicines is typically a decade-long process. One urgent strategy is to investigate whether current drugs on the market might also have efficacy in fighting the virus or its symptoms, such as the extreme immune system reaction known as the cytokine storm. This search for new uses for a currently marketed drug is known as repurposing. 505b2 refers to the code provision relating in part to the approval of drugs repurposed for a new indication. Our presenters are Edward Allera, co-chair of Buchanan, Ingersoll, and Rooney's FDA and Biotechnology group, and Barbara Binzak Blumenfeld, PhD, a shareholder of Buchanan Ingersoll in the same practice group. A couple housekeeping points first. One, if you're not already on mute, please do so to optimize sound quality for everyone. This is particularly important if you're listening over computer speakers because it will echo back to us unless you are on mute. Two, if you have any question along the way, please enter it in the chat box that you can open by clicking the chat box icon. It's kind of a comic bubble, comment or thought bubble on the upper right side of your screen. The speakers will answer as many as they have time for. Three, a recording of this webcast with slides will be posted to the Kinexum website, and a link will be distributed to registrants of this webcast within the next several business days. And finally, future Kinexum webcasts include federal resources, such as BARDA, Department of Defense, and NIH funding for COVID-19 and other programs or other indications in June, and therapeutic approaches for type 1 diabetes in July. Please look out for these if you're interested in these areas. I'd like now to turn the mic over to Barbara to start things off. Barbara?
Great. Thank you very much, Thomas. And on behalf of Ed and myself, we'd really like to thank Kinexum for inviting us to present today. We're excited to be here, and I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion. So if we could move to the next slide. Thank you. I'd like to just run through briefly what we expect to talk about today. First off, I'll be providing some level-setting background on 505b2 NDAs and the role that they play in the life cycle of a new chemical entity. Then I'm going to be discussing the role of drug repurposing in the COVID-19 era and some of the challenges that are being faced. And then finally, Ed will be addressing NDAs both today and as we look past COVID-19. Next slide, please. And next slide. I'd like to start by talking about some general level-setting background. This is a very simplistic, common view of what people think about as the life cycle of a new chemical entity. Very linear. There's birth, and then there's the life support phase. I was going to say that it's death of the new chemical entity, but Ed had indicated that it's actually on life support at this point. And by that, I mean the following. We all know that once a new chemical entity is discovered, the appropriate studies are conducted, and a 505b1 new drug application is filed and approved. We also know that after a certain amount of time, that product is going to go off patent. There will be no more remaining exclusivity than it may have been awarded by FDA, and we're now going to have ANDA approval. So while that B1 product still exists, it's on life support because it has so much competition now. Next slide, please. But I would posit that actually, if we think about it, the lifetime of a new chemical entity is much more nuanced and can actually be lengthened by a couple of things. So first off, we know that a 505b1 applicant can in fact file a supplement, a 505b1 supplement, to introduce changes to that product. In many cases, they will introduce a new indication, but there could be other modifications made as well. However, another sign of the maturity phase of a new chemical entity is the introduction of a B2 NDA. In this case, you may have an entirely different sponsor who was not involved with the B1 NDA, who now wants to introduce changes to that product. The original product will still be marketed, but now you also have this B2. It could be thought of sort of as a product extension. And both B1s and B2s are subject to their own generic competition. So you could see how this could actually become a very complex web of drug products. But the B1 supplement and a brand new B2 NDA serve to lengthen the phase, the life cycle of the new chemical entity. Next slide, please. So let's explore each of these in just a little bit more detail. So, new drug discovery. We understand that the B1 NDA is the culmination of the preclinical and the clinical data that is generated about the new chemical entity. Generally, it will include studies in one or more appropriate animal models that most closely mimic the human model of the disease. And it will include at least 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical trials that can show the product is efficacious. We also know that the B1 is always going to be approved for a particular active ingredient in a certain population for a certain use and in a certain dosage form and dosage strength. Once the B1 is approved, that sponsor gets to list the patent, with both the product and method of use patent, in the Orange Book. And the Orange Book also lists any exclusivity that is approved as well. Next slide, please. So, further, in the lifetime of the new chemical entity, the B1 NDA drug we'll see is rarely the optimal drug product. Why is that? Well, simply speaking, what is approved in a carefully controlled clinical trial is not the same as the drug as we know it once it's in real-world use. We know that clinical trials have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. We also know that once the drug hits the marketplace, it's going to be used in a much larger patient population. It may, in fact, be used off-label as well. And the people using the drug are going to have other comorbidities. They may be taking other drug products. And so we can learn a lot of information about a new chemical entity once it hits the market. So this additional data is going to lead to potentially product improvement and therefore enters the B2 NDA. Next slide, please. So this is the maturity phase that I referenced. So as I noted, a B1 sponsor could introduce their own changes through the B1 supplement. However, an entity, a sponsor that was never involved in the B1 product could decide to get into the space if they think the opportunity looks ripe, and they could actually advance that product to the next iteration, and that product could find its own life cycle. Next, please. So the B2 NDA. The critical question, and this will be reflected throughout our talk today, is how do I show my product's value add? So let's say that you can change, technically, you know that you have the capability to change a solid oral dosage form to a liquid. Well, the question is there a market for that liquid product? It may very well be that it's a product used heavily in seniors or pediatrics, and so those patients may benefit from a liquid dosage form. But that may not simply be the case in every instance. Likewise, you may be able to think about changing your dosage strength and dosage form so that you can go from an immediate to a modified release. Again, sometimes these are technically capable of happening. The question is there a value add to doing so? Will it serve the benefit of patients? A B2 NDA, critically, is going to leverage existing data and knowledge about the drug that's already been approved. So FDA does not expect you to entirely recreate the wheel, similar to an ANDA. However, a B2 should not be confused with an ANDA because you're still going to have to support the change that you want to introduce with new data and bridging data that will adequately support the change that you want to make. Next slide, please. So let's finish up one more slide here on the lifetime. We also know that when generic drugs are approved, it's usually because the new chemical entity has lost its patent protection. It is no longer has exclusivity. It may have been awarded. The generics are approved, and we've seen also that on the first day that someone can file a generic drug application, there can be dozens or more first filers. And all of those generics are going to share the benefit of 180-day exclusivity, which is a statutory award of exclusivity. We also know that as the number of ANDAs increase, we're going to see a precipitous drop in the price of the new chemical entity. Hence, it's on life support at this point. And as I noted, a generic can rely either on a B1 or a B2 drug product as its reference drug. So both B1s and B2s are going to have their own life cycle of generic competition. Next slide, please. So going back to the B2s themselves. So as I noted, this is where you're going to want to introduce one or more change to a reference drug. The key to a B2 is that at least some of the studies that you are using for your approval were not conducted by you, and you have no right of reference to those studies. So you are, in other words, going to be relying on FDA's previous findings and other studies that might be in the literature to support your approval. You're also going to, however, have to include appropriate bridging studies and contemporary safety data as well. And we'll talk about each of these in a moment. Next slide, please. So what are some of these typical B2 drug product changes? Well, the most common ones, I would say, would be a change in formulation, dosage strength or regimen, a route of administration, or an indication. However, there's numerous others listed here as well that have all been or could be the subject of a B2 application. Now, it's important to remember that if you are simply duplicating your B1 product, that you are then in fact a generic. And if you instead confuse it and file a B2, you would be refused to file by FDA. So there's a myriad of ways that you can change a product already been approved. Next slide, please. I also mentioned bridging studies. Well, what does this really mean? And I wish that I could give one concise answer, but the fact of the matter is that because there are so many possible changes you could be introducing, that it's really going to be unique and individualized, depending not only on that change or changes, but also on the nature of the drug product itself, the population, and any number of other factors. But in general, the bridging studies are going to include perhaps a safety and tolerability profile, perhaps a toxicology data update, clinical pharmacology, or even clinical data. The key question you have to ask yourself when you're developing a B2 is how can I scientifically and medically support the change that I want to introduce? And how do I establish the clinical benefit of the change that I want to make? Again, these are important points that keep popping up throughout the life cycle of a B2. Also, you want to think about how can I protect against FDA revisionism. And by this, Ed and I mean, we have had examples where clients have gone into the B2 development process. They included, let's say, PK or PD data and thought that this was going to be adequate to qualify as clinical data to get exclusivity. Reviewers may have agreed, but when it came time to have approval, the Office of Chief Counsel, in at least one instance, disagreed and said that it wasn't sufficient for being awarded exclusivity for a B2. So the key is that you need to make sure that you're on the same page with FDA. You need to make sure that you have spoken with them and you know what is going to be required for your approval. Next slide, please. And to this end, one great way to do this at the outset is to have a pre-IND meeting with FDA. Now, these meetings are always optional. FDA never requires them, but we also always recommend that sponsors take advantage of them. And why is that? Well, first off, you're allowed to then introduce FDA to your product. You yourself, as a company, may not have had prior interactions with FDA. So you get the chance to meet them, and you get the opportunity to show your bona fides and that you are taking your drug development seriously. But you also, equally important, get to ask very pointed questions of FDA about your development pathway, and this can be critical. What am I going to need in a pre-IND meeting for B2? Well, again, I wish I could say there was one magic formula, but the truth of the matter is that depending on, again, the API, depending on the prior approval, the changes you want to make, what your package looks like is going to look very different. But in general, I would say you're going to want to present some of the historical data that's already known. You're going to want to fully describe the changes you're proposing to introduce. And you also want to discuss the proposed bridging studies that you see are necessary. And of course, draft protocols. Now, a lot of people want to just skip the pre-IND meeting and skip the IND in some cases and go straight to the finish line in the era of COVID-19. But again, the fact is FDA may be acting more quickly, but FDA is not want corners cut. And a robust pre-IND package is, again, going to establish you, your company, and your product in the eyes of FDA. Next slide. I also mentioned that you're going to need to include contemporary safety data. And this has led to something that Ed and I have thought about as the safety paradox. What is a safety paradox? Well, in our view, it's the situation where a B2 sponsor will all too often rely on historical B1 safety data without considering the contemporary safety data that has emerged since that B1 was approved. Now, critically, safety data, as we know, is not static. Safety data is a snapshot in time at the time of approval about what we know about that drug and API. But again, once it's out in the market, we're going to gain a lot more information. So it's a moving target. You have more patient exposure, which could result in new safety signals being observed in a particular population. You may also find that the new chemical entity labeling has changed since the time of approval. So clearly B1 sponsors know safety is not static, so B2 sponsors need to be aware of this as well. Next slide, please. So what are some sources of this contemporary safety data? This is just a laundry list of things that Ed and I have thought about and put down on paper, and undoubtedly there are many others as well. But things like pharmacovigilance monitoring, looking at what adverse events have been reported to FDA and perhaps in other sources is important. You might look to whether or not FDA has issued any safety alerts or Dear Doctor letters. And there's all sorts of ways to mine other data, including things that we may have learned from social media, interestingly enough. But you can also look at phase 4 studies, recalls, and I would suggest even a couple things that may not be first and foremost in your mind, but things like, is this B1 drug one that is being paid for? Is it receiving coverage? Is it listed on formularies? All of this information can give you a sense of whether or not you need to be additionally aware of any safety changes that have occurred since the B1 was approved. Next slide, please. So let's talk about exclusivity for just a moment. So I mentioned that a B2 NDA may in fact be eligible for exclusivity, and this is a 3-year period. Now, it's not automatic, as I'll talk about in just a moment. If you happen to be getting approval for an orphan drug indication, you may also be eligible for 7 years of orphan drug exclusivity. But beware, the 7 and 3 years are not additive, so you're not going to end up with 10. However, there is a potential 6-month pediatric exclusivity period available as well, and this will add to any other exclusivity periods you may be awarded, and it's also added to any existing patents that are listed in the Orange Book. So all of these together could potentially add up to a very nice period of exclusivity that would protect you against generic competition. Next slide, please. Well, how do I get exclusivity? As I noted, it's not an automatic situation. So in order to qualify to get exclusivity, your application has to contain new clinical investigations that were not simply bioavailability studies, that you, in fact, conducted that were essential to approval. So a new clinical investigation, of course, it just means that FDA cannot have relied on that study for a previous approval. And it must be an essential clinical investigation, meaning that there's no other data available that FDA could rely on in lieu of that study to support approval. So again, this shows you how important it is that you are on the same page with FDA. If you are expecting that the studies you conduct are going to get you exclusivity on the back end. Well, what protection does this provide? Well, what it means is that FDA is not going to approve another application for 3 years for the same conditions of approval. Now, I will say that just last year there was a DC court case that threw the meaning of this term, condition of approval, into a bit of flux. Long and short of it is that FDA said, when it issued its final decision to a couple of B2 applicants who had filed a citizen petition, is that as drug product improvements become more and more incrementally small, that the exclusivity that's awarded could similarly become more and more narrowed in the future. So if you make, a big change to a B1 and you're changing, let's say, a dosage form and a regimen and an indication, that's one thing. If you're making an incrementally small tweak, you might get your B2 approved and you might get exclusivity. But how that exclusivity protects you may look very different for that second drug than for that first drug. Next slide, please. So patents, just a moment here, and I won't spend a lot of time because the patent regime is very complicated, but suffice it to say that a B2 sponsor really straddles both worlds of a B1 and a generic applicant. And by that I mean a B2 sponsor, like an ANDA applicant, is going to have to certify to patents that are in the Orange Book for its reference products. So if the B1 sponsor has patents listed, but you as a B2 sponsor think you can work around those, you have to file certification. The B2 sponsor also must list their own patent for their product. And so the B2 sponsor must list their own patent, and then the ANDA sponsor must certify to those. So a B2 sponsor kind of plays it both ways when it comes to the Orange Book and patents. Next slide, please. And finally, the last bit of background I want to say is that there's other ways that you can think about 505b2 value adds. For instance, it is possible for a B2 sponsor to redeem a priority review voucher that was issued to another sponsor. So how does this work? Well, it's possible that an entirely different sponsor may have received one of these priority review vouchers if it got approval for a rare pediatric disease drug or a tropical disease drug. Now, these can be redeemed later for another application, which permits the person who's cashing in or redeeming this voucher to have a shortened review period. Critically, these vouchers can be sold and purchased, and a number of them have been for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So if you find you're a B2 sponsor and you have your hands on a voucher, you could redeem that with your application if the approval timeline is critical. So for example, if you are aware that in a certain amount of time a B1 is going to go off patent, and it's suspected that it's going to have a large number of generic competition, you may want to think about redeeming a review voucher so that you can have a speedy review of your B2, so you can get on the market, establish yourself, and make sure you have a piece of that pie before there's generic competition for the B1 sponsor. So again, there's a lot of things at play here, a lot of strategy involved, but it's an important piece to keep in mind that you may find very valuable. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to transition into drug repurposing in the era of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So when we think of drug repurposing, we think of finding a new use for an approved drug, as Thomas said. And in that respect, you should be thinking, well, this is a B2 opportunity. Now, I just put here a few highlights of some of the most recent numbers that I found as of a few days ago. Between clinicaltrials.gov and WHO's international registry, there are over 3,000 worldwide studies going on that are trying to address in one way or another COVID. The Reagan-Udall Foundation for FDA has broken these down for clinicaltrials.gov entries and has noted that by and large, the largest number of interventions being tested are for drug products. Now, not all of these are repurposed drugs, but it's clear that in the case of repurposing, because we know so much about a product already, those are the prime candidates to think about for treating or preventing COVID-19. Next slide, please. One or two here that we've heard a lot about in recent months are chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. So these drugs right now are being distributed out of the U.S. national stockpile under something that FDA issued known as an emergency use authorization, which is only alive, if you will, during the pandemic era. But under this EUA, healthcare systems and providers are able to receive product out of the stockpile. But in return, they need to track adverse events and report them to FDA. So this raises a couple of important and practical questions for what's going to happen with the data that's generated. For instance, who's going to own it? Or will this data qualify as real-world data that the original sponsors could then in turn use to get an additional approval? A lot of this remains unknown, but for now, we know that this is one great example of repurposing that we're hearing about. We also know that there are some medical issues associated with using this, and it has come under fire to some degree. Next slide, please. Another one we've heard a lot about is remdesivir. Now, under FDA's emergency use authorization for this one, Gilead was going to supply it to third parties, and then those third parties distribute the drugs. Now, you probably are aware there's been a lot of complaints registered in the immediate aftermath of this distribution scheme. People were wondering, particularly physicians, patients, and hospitals, what is the distribution mechanism, because it's not at all transparent. Originally, HHS and FEMA were in charge of distributing through AmerisourceBergen. That changed about a week after the uproar occurred, and now the federal government is simply distributing drug to each of the state health departments and allowing those states to determine how to distribute. Next slide, please. So we see that there's a lot of activity going on, clearly. Numerous companies are getting into the fray. Most of them for good. We wouldn't doubt that. Some, it's quite possible, are entering for promotional reasons or possibly to even incur a stock price boost. We also know that large and established companies really understand more than anyone else what needs to be done, because the guidance coming from FDA is changing regularly, and these companies are very well equipped to monitor that. However, small and new companies want to get involved too, and they're learning their way. It's really been trial by fire, perhaps in many cases. The other players are also engaging as well. You see a lot of individual physicians getting involved with expanded access INDs, individual researchers, and importantly, big research consortia who are monitoring and testing thousands of already approved drug products to see what may in fact work against the novel coronavirus. Next slide, please. Repurposing has certainly brought difficulties in this era. For instance, it's been challenging at times to secure the appropriate active pharmaceutical ingredients or even finished dosage forms. We're seeing a trend, I think, where a lot of countries are going to want to keep product for themselves and their own citizens, which is throwing into disarray the global supply chain. Furthermore, the global supply chain is being disrupted by things like plant shutdowns, perhaps, if they were hit hard by the pandemic. And some of these may not be fully back up to speed and production capacity yet. And another area that we're seeing repurposing difficulties is the fact that when you talk about repurposing something already approved, if the supply chain is not robust enough, that drug is going to come from somewhere else. And unfortunately, perhaps, it's coming from people who are already prescribed those drugs. So, for instance, I saw just yesterday another popular press article where hydroxychloroquine prescriptions that are being used for COVID seems to be taking away the ability of people who use hydroxychloroquine for inflammatory diseases to get their own prescriptions filled. So this is perhaps one inevitable downside to the drug repurposing that we're seeing. But I also think that we're going to see a lot of supply chain diversification in the coming days and years. People are looking about how they can source things from multiple countries, perhaps instead of just relying on one or two big suppliers. So I think we'll see a lot of impact coming out of COVID on these supply chain issues. Next slide, please. The other thing that we're seeing the start of is that this very rapid response and this rush to get something on the market is leading to subpar FDA filings. There's been a lot of commentary that the earliest COVID-19 studies are in fact not as valuable as they could be. They perhaps were not designed as robustly as they should have been, or they've been underpowered. Now, FDA has issued more guidance of late, and so people are taking advantage of that. Also, there's a push towards operating under master protocols, because as everybody tries to recruit the same subject for their trials, we're going to see perhaps a lack of appropriate people to enroll in all of these thousands of studies. It's important to remember, though, as I noted before, that a rapid response is not the same as a shortcut, because FDA will always make safety and effectiveness paramount, and that doesn't change in this era. The equation of the risk-benefit may be shifting, but you still have to prove safety and effectiveness. And at the end of the day, if something is not well planned out and well thought out, and it's a primitive filing, it's simply going to delay the review period for everybody. Next slide, please. Now, I noted that master protocols are becoming more discussed every day. And it's possible that master protocols may in fact avoid redundancy of effort. I've listed here 5 of those that I was able to identify occurring in the U.S. and around the world. All of them employ an adaptive trial design. So as things appear promising or less promising, different arms of the study can be added or dropped. Now, most of these studies that I've already started are in fact testing repurposed drugs. They're testing a lot of the big names, if you will. They're testing remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, and several others. So they're just getting underway, but clearly they are becoming more talked about in a way that we may look to running studies in the future. FDA itself has expressed an interest in developing master protocols, but up to this point, it hasn't itself developed or released any of these. Next slide, please. Another way to avoid redundancy in this era can be to work through one of the several organized consortia that have been formed. Now, the first one here, active, is perhaps one of the biggest. It includes nonprofits, it includes pharma companies, and it includes several of the HHS agencies. They are, in fact, working on their own master protocols, and they have individual working groups looking at all sorts of aspects of COVID, everything from clinical trial feasibility to candidate compounds and a number of other efforts. The second one here, the Accelerator, is a purely private effort, spearheaded in large measure by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They are trying to aggregate resources, but they're also offering funding opportunities. And the final one here, COVID R&D, is comprised of pharma and VCs. Again, they're looking at their own master protocol development, and they have their own sub-working groups to look at how to aggregate available resources. So these are all great. I think they're geared in many ways towards, again, the big pharma companies. A lot of those big names are members of these various consortia. But as their efforts develop and they are able to issue more master protocols, I think there'll be additional ways for other companies to become involved as well. Next slide, please. So in closing with my portion today, I'd like to just remind you that in this era, there's a number of key questions. As we've talked about, you have to think about, if you're going to jump into this, how do I recruit subjects? And to that issue, are there master protocols available that you may be able to now or in the future take advantage of? How do I get funding? That's always an issue. We know that BARDA, NIAID, and the Therapeutics Accelerator that I mentioned from the last slide are all sources of funding. And finally, and perhaps one of the most important things that Ed and I wrestle with, is how do you identify a champion for your product within government? We get asked this numerous times a week. And the question is, how do I bring my technology to the forefront? How do I get the attention of FDA or NIH or CDC? And the fact of the matter is, it's difficult because attention is spread thin and there's a lot of noise out there. So again, working through the established channels, but trying to identify someone who can help you, that's going to be key if you are looking to get involved in the COVID response. So with that, I'd like to thank you for my section, and I'm now going to turn it over to Ed to conclude and to talk about the future.
Thank you, Barbara. Today and beyond. I mean, it's a brave new world, as we would say. So why don't we begin? I think, things are very dynamic. Things have changed dramatically. I'm sorry, why don't you change the slide? Things have changed dramatically. The generic industry is deflationary, but there's ongoing price scrutiny. That's come back. It's going to be important. You have to remember that the healthcare systems are crushed in this COVID. They're projected to lose $500 billion before Labor Day, but the payers have come out okay. So you have to look into those marketplaces as to how you deal with the forthcoming market. Markets are high and stock prices, I've been told, because a lot of the investors feel this is going to be a terrible year and they're betting on next year. So it's sort of looking at how do we go about this? And because there are just other factors. In addition, I think one thing I want to embellish is the vouchers. If you look at products that have gotten pediatric vouchers, tropical disease vouchers, they've all been B2s. Okay, used real world evidence, and they got the money. We had TB, we had malaria. So the B2 is another factor that has leveraged the money and the data on real world evidence and move forward. You've got to leverage existing data. You're going to need fewer clinical trials, but you're still going to need data. And you have a faster time to market, but the market factors are changing. How it's going to play out next year, unclear. Remember, why don't we go to the next slide? Remember, we are in the process of beginning negotiations for user fees, which will affect B2s. So, is your change feasible? But I tend to be more crass. It's really, how can you afford to do this, and how do you get your return? How do I enroll my subjects? How do I establish my bona fides? Because particularly now, if you show up and say you're the world's smartest antiviral agent and researcher, and no one's heard of you, and you want to do something quick, that's not going to fly. So you have to look at establishing your bona fides. How can I work with the existing processes? How can I get involved? For example, the easiest one, perhaps, the one I've been involved with, is the COVID-19 accelerator with Dr. Amy Abernathy has been at the forefront of gathering as much information about all these data from everywhere they can to see what they can learn. This is another mechanism to learn what's going on, establish your bona fides with FDA, and it helps you look at real world data and real world evidence. When one thinks about real world evidence, it's been around forever. When you think about the DESI review, they looked at the literature. When you looked at paper NDAs, it looked at the literature. If you look at most 505b2s today, a lot of them are orphan, and they're looking at real world evidence and real world data. So you have to really think about, there are many opportunities to gather real world data, to do this in a very efficient way, but I didn't say cheap. And it then helps you gauge how you can show your value add, how you can show your clinical benefit, because you have to show clinical benefit, but as a number of FDAers have asked me and described, who decides? You know, is it the payer? Is it the patient? So we're in an area where you help, you know, we're helping you in this space. You're able to tell your story and focus your story. So how can I get rolling? The other thing I want to point out here is, do I need a partner develop? What's intriguing is there are people who will finance development. There are also people independently who will fund marketing and launch with non-dilutive financing. So there's just a lot of key factors that you can look at that really are creating just new opportunities as we move forward. Next slide, please. There's always going to be a product, but you've got to show your data. The more data you have, okay, the stronger your position is going to be, because you show up at FDA in a bona fide researcher with a thoughtful plan. You've looked at safety and effectiveness equation. While it's shifting towards risk, you still can't, you know, they still raise issues. We just had a client where we were able to get involved with the investigators. We found a champion at NIAID in their clinical trials program, and that person became the champion for this product, and FDA lifted, you know, moved it forward. So it's getting known, learning the system, learning the players, getting known, okay? And then, but you can't cut corners. B2s, while they're not a new drug application, it still requires effort. And your clinical benefit meeting is still paramount. What I like to say is a lesson I learned from a good friend of mine who ran 3M was, in times of crisis, focus on your blocking and tackling, because when it passes, you're going to be better positioned to take control. And I think now is the time to really look at what can we learn with how FDA is being more flexible in dealing with 505b2s in the COVID crisis. How will that change? You know, will it revert to more concerns about safety? And how do I ensure I move forward and have those factors considered? Next slide. So the most important question always remains, how do I show my product value? Okay. Most of us in this space are developing products, and it's critical when deciding whether to approve the particular product. What's your cost? When you're seeking investors, they want to know what your product add is. What's your value add? When you're seeking for partners for marketing, what's your value add? And when you're advocating for acceptance by physicians and patients, you got to find that champion. You got to find someone who's willing to take the time to work with you on the protocol, on getting you patients. And they have to really understand that value add. So you've got to really push it there. And then the bottom line, how are you going to get paid? And how will the changes that we face today play out over the next 2 years? So with reimbursement changing, user fees coming, changes, it is a time to really be alert. keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in Washington, because the reality is that's where the decisions are going to be made. That's where you have to really be knowledgeable and, if possible, a participant in the process. You don't have to show up in Washington because now everybody's virtual, but you have opportunities now which in essence can level the playing field. I've had investors and investment banks say they're very happy with this virtuality because it's leveled the playing field. People are able to show their bona fides, show their credibility, show what they're doing, show they know what they're doing, and do it virtually, and there are real opportunities here. So I think as we move forward, that's my big takeaway is there are real opportunities. Take advantage of the opportunities, but you have to really be engaged. Staying isolated, in an academic situation or even an isolated situation, you can be the richest kid in a small town, but it doesn't get you anywhere when you go to New York. You just have to really pay attention, get known, be perceived, and that is, helps you establish where you're going, okay, how to get there faster. So that's basically what I wanted to say. I think there's great opportunity. I'm happy to help anybody. I've cranked out a bunch of materials over the last 2 months, and it's just great time. So with that, why don't we turn to the questions? Does that make sense?
Thank you, Ed. I've got a question here from Adrienne. What lasting impact, if any, will COVID procedural changes have on FDA regulations and protocols after there is a vaccine and COVID has faded from focus? Will anything change in FDA as a result of the COVID experience?
Well, I think a lot has already changed. Now, the other thing, waiting for a vaccine may be like waiting for Godot. So like Gardasil's on its fifth generation, or I don't know, third or fourth vaccine generation. It's going to take time. There's not going to be a silver bullet. So the changes, I think, will continue. They are far more open-minded. Everybody tells me they're exhausted. They can't, they're going full speed. They've been going full speed since, March. And, the backlog. They've got this sort of, if you will, parallel shadow government. You sort of got Cedar people working along. You got the lawyers. So everybody's going full speed. I think the process will continue. I think, again, what Amy Abernathy's doing, I urge you to monitor what Amy Abernathy's doing. I think she has a vision of the future that is rare. I think those types of things will continue, using more real-world data, real-world evidence, but also how do those pieces fit together with existing things? And Cedar is much more open-minded about this.
Okay, I just realized something. People who can read the chat box, you can type your questions in, but Donald was asking, how do we ask questions? It sounds like maybe there are some people who are only calling in who aren't seeing the chat box. Donald, do you want to take this opportunity to ask your question? We'll give you a couple seconds to speak up.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to ask about racemic mix formulation. So if you develop a racemically pure formulation, is that, obviously there should be some improved medical benefit, but is that sufficient to give enough of a change, that particular formulation change, to get an approval from the FDA?
It can be. Now, there's actually a special statutory provision that was added to deal with race mates because of some political issues arose about 15 or 20 years ago. But a pure racemic mixture can be a separate drug.
Donald, any follow-up?
Yeah, I just maybe, Ed, if you want to send that to me. You said there was some special.
Okay.
Thanks.
I will do that.
So, Donald, you can see Ed's contact Well, actually,
No, I know.
if you're only calling in, I guess you can't, but you can contact Jennifer at Kinexum, and we can pass your question on to Ed. Anush is asking, can you talk about the skinny labeling, quote-unquote, issue with 505b2 and how one can circumvent this issue?
I think it's tricky, and it really gets back to you have to have a constant dialogue with FDA and the reviewing division. Okay, I think unlike ANDAs where you get a shot and go back and forth, reviewing divisions are much more open to discuss this. And I think the other part of it is you have to recognize you may have to push. And that, as I say, you got the shadow government, you got the senior people, and then maybe you have to deal with the lawyers. So you have to recognize you're in a negotiation, and you have to do it politely and professionally, but there are ways to proceed to push yourself as far as you can.
And for the benefit of others here, and Barbara, I'll get to you in a moment, but could you describe in a couple sentences what the skinny labeling issue is and why one wants to try to circumvent it?
It often limits the claims you can make, based on your data, as well as trying to figure out the historic safety issues. This gentleman had an additional follow-up.
Barbara, did you have something? I know she has a follow-up question, but Barbara,
yes.
do you have something?
Oh, can I?
Go ahead,
Anush. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Barbara.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just going to add to that what Ed said. To the extent you might be asking about blocking exclusivity or things like that, or patents, and carving out around certain indications, I would just remind everybody that when it comes to a B2, you can have potentially many different reference drugs that you could select as the basis for your B2. So you may in fact find one that gives you some additional latitude in terms of the changes that you could make that aren't protected by exclusivity or patents themselves. So just remember that there may be other options. And this is where I often, with another one of my colleagues, Matt Fedowitz, who's an IP attorney, we help people take a look sort of at the patent and exclusivity landscape in a holistic sense to think about issues like what might be the best reference product to choose so that you can try to avoid that issue. Perhaps that isn't what you were referring to, but it's still a point I'd like to make.
Sure. You have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. So thank you both for that. One other issue that I've heard regarding the 505b2 is substitution. So, for instance, if it's if the product, if the originator product has already been genericized, and I'm using that, and I'm trying to find a new indication and go through the 505b2 pathway at the point of paying, due to the substitution laws. The existing generic may be just substituted instead of my product, which I had gone through the 505b2 pathway to get the approval. At the point of when the physician is making the prescription. Have you heard anything about this issue? And if so, what strategies have you seen companies employ to make sure that their product is the one that's been prescribed and not the generic?
Yeah, you have to. Those issues don't arise after approval. Those issues need to be addressed in product development. You have to understand and keep your eye on what the competition is, how it's being compensated. How can you develop a product that you feel comfortable that payers will recognize value for and pay? If you get it approved and then start looking about how you're going to protect yourself, you're just lost, okay? Because there's a lot of pressure, so you have to have real value add, dosage form delivery, they're just things you can do. What's your value add? And and part of value add is how do you protect yourself from generic competition? Because that's what investors want to know. Fighting, I mean, I've fought with all payers, and they have a one-track mind. Don't pay. You know, the average claim takes about 7 touches with an insurance claim. I was asked to be on the board at one point of a payer, and I raised that question, and they don't care. Their view is people will give up. So it's diligence, but primarily it's planning. I'm sorry, I've talked too long.
Okay, thank you for that. David had a question for Barbara. Have you had any experience with when a novel excipient is used in a 505b2 application? If so, what type of safety data was required to support the use of that novel excipient? Was clinical data required, or can standard animal tox and bridging arguments be used?
Well, I haven't personally been involved in one where it was just a novel excipient. We know that formulation changes, which could include excipients, can be the subject of a B2 application. So I think the key there is going to be, of course, looking at the impact of that excipient change as a whole. Certainly, your standard animal tox and bridging data that you mentioned will be imperative. I think also perhaps it depends on whether or not you need clinical as to whether or not any other changes are made. For instance, if there's an excipient change, but that's part and parcel of a dosage form change, that could be one answer versus whether or not there were any other changes. I don't know. Ed, do you have any additional thoughts on that one?
No, I think, that there's protocols for excipients, and, FDA, excipients can be tricky. And, what's the value add that you bring to, they're usually improving the solubility, and, there's usually a distinct value add for this product with the addition of the excipient. So really, how do you really utilize that to frame it as part of your drug development process so you ensure reimbursement and you're not trapped? But what's your value add?
I think stability.
So go ahead. Sorry.
I think that this is Ashok Mukherjee, ex-reviewer in Cedar. I think you have to look into the stability also. Sometimes there are breakdown products of safety concerns, and they may look into that. That's a very important issue in addition to the new excipients. A lot of B2 applications have new excipients, and so if the excipient is not compendial, means not already an approved product, you have to establish that safety.
Just for the benefit of people listening in, that was Ashok Mukherjee, one of our Kinexum consultants. So if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to follow up with Buchanan or with Kinexum. At this point, we've reached the top of the hour. So I want to thank the presenters and the audience, the attendees. It's been a great webcast. And again, we'll post it to our Kinexum website. Links will be sent to you by early next week. Also important, you may receive a survey that will provide us feedback on this webinar. If you do, please fill it out to help us improve our webinars. With that, we thank the speakers and attendees and wish you all a good day and a great weekend. Thank you so much.